Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this brand new episode of the Mindful Muslim podcast, where I will be speaking to Aiysha Khalil. I hope you find this a really beneficial conversation, inshallah. Aiyysha, thank you so much for joining me on the Inspirited Minds podcast. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. How are you?
Good, fantastic. Really pleased to have you as our next guest on the podcast. I suppose that a starting point is just to introduce yourself, however way you see fit, really, to our listeners and our viewers as well. Go ahead.
It's always an awkward one, isn't it? I am somebody who I wouldn't say I'm a professional in the field, but I would say that I'm somebody who has a lot of lived experience of mental health and mental health issues, and that has been sort of actually supplemented by education and some of the things I've done over the years. So I have a diagnosis of BPD, probably PTSD. I mean, the two are linked. I was diagnosed with clinical depression when I was 14, and there's been a myriad of other things along the years. So I'm 30 years old now. I graduated with my bachelor's in psychology at 21, and I've been working ever since in various fields. And I guess through lived experience, mental health and sort of trauma and the various conditions have always been interesting to me. It's been an area that I feel quite passionate about, and I wanted to take that further. I wanted to use what I've experienced to help other people. And so that shaped reaching out to you guys and being familiar with your work. And I also then volunteered for about a year with the Listening Place, which is a charity in London, and they do fantastic work. I mean, I'm familiar with Samaritans and other organizations, but I think what makes them so special is you have an ongoing relationship with who you speak to. So yeah, that's in a nutshell where I'm at. I'm not currently working in the mental health field. But I guess where there's the personal aspect of having a diagnosis, it's still relevant. It's always relevant to my life on a day-to-day basis anyway. So yeah, that's me.
Great. No, thank you so much for that. That was quite a lot of things there that I'd love to explore with you a little bit more. So I guess the first thing was you mentioned more than a couple of actual difficulties with mental health, mental well-being you had before. You also mentioned a diagnosis. For those of us that are not familiar with BPD, can you explain that a little bit further, how it came about, maybe symptoms, all of that stuff?
Oh yeah. So it's so heavy, the diagnosis in itself. So I want to make it clear for starters, like you said, so it's not actually bipolar. So a lot of people, when they hear BPD, the automatic assumption is bipolar disorder. There are similarities between the two, but I'm referring to borderline personality disorder and I'd say BPD. So I kind of had a feeling before my diagnosis. So it's linked to trauma. And I come from a trauma background as a child, which obviously I can expand on that, but in a nutshell, I got married when I was 21 and completely not healed from anything. Nothing was addressed. And I think that's very, very prominent in sort of certain communities, especially South Asian community, or in a lot of the Muslim community. Things happen to families, to people, and it's kind of just, it's done now. You get on with it. Like nothing's actually addressed or put into place to heal from what's happened. It's kind of swept under the rug, or you just think you're fine. So I just thought, it's really bizarre because looking back, I really wasn't in a place to get married. But I was married, and that's when, so borderline personality disorder has a huge, it's around relationships. So I think how there's a lot of different conditions kind of have characteristics to them. So borderline personality disorder really has its basis in relationships, your social interactions, how you feel about other people, how you feel about yourself in relationships. And it came to the forefront in a huge way. And I started to realize that's when it was undeniably obvious to me that something's not right here. And it was pretty chaotic, and I feel a lot for my ex-husband at that point, because it was a lot to handle for both of us. And that's when I kind of had an inkling. And I remember I randomly came across like a YouTube video of people describing borderline personality disorder, and it was kind of talking about how they felt. And there was this just shock moment where I was like, they're describing me. They're describing what I go through. And so I started with a counselor. And so that's another thing, like, yes, I got counseling, but it's really important, I would say, to anybody who thinks that they're feeling in a way that's not right, to just go and find out. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It will make the process, like, now I wish that I had done that so much earlier. Just to have gone, and I mean, I knew I was dealing with at that point, and I think some of that is because of my psychology background. But it was maybe after a couple of years that I went and saw a psychologist, and I remember saying to him, I'm about 99% sure of what I have, but I'll tell you what I've experienced and you can give me the official diagnosis. And so at 27, I knew at around 23, but I didn't get my official diagnosis until about 27 or 26. So it was quite a while after. I could give you a run through of the symptoms, but there's quite a lot. There's quite a few. And it tends to be comorbid with things like substance abuse or depression or eating disorders. So I think that can add to the mix of the diagnosis, where people might outwardly present as, maybe anorexic, but the underlying issue is the symptoms of borderline personality disorder, and they're trying to cope with it through anorexia or substance abuse or whatever it may be.
And was this the case for you in terms of there was that was an underlying thing for you?
I think depression. I think I thought I was dealing with depression for a long time. And I thought it was and I remember when I was married, I thought it was my relationship. I mean, it compounded it, but I thought it was what the people around me were doing. So one of the things is like fear of abandonment and growing up in a chaotic household, my mum coped with it by going out a lot to sort of get away, and so I didn't have like I understand it, but to a child, I understand it as an adult, but children and the way your mind develops at age, they don't understand why that's happening. So I would get really, really worked up and anxious if he had like planned to go away, and like say he'd go away till about 6 p.m. In my mind, he's told me 6 p.m. and it runs over to like 9 or 10. That was an issue. I would start getting anxious, especially if I couldn't get in touch. And so to me it was like, oh, he's gone out late again, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, maybe there could be better communication, but it was my stuff making me react to a situation in either, you know, an out of proportionate way, or, you know, like they call it, people would say triggers, right? In psychology speak, you'd say that was a triggering event for you. So I was getting triggered, we can say, by situations around me constantly. And so to me, it wasn't my stuff. It was, oh, they've done this or he's done this. So it wasn't very obvious to me straight away.
Yeah. What other situations do you think you could mention that, so this example that you just gave us, you kind of clearly said you think it stemmed from this particular things that happened in your childhood. So were there other things that you discovered either by yourself or with a counselor that you kind of explored and realized, oh, this stems from something else? Was there any other things that you can recall?
Sorry, do you mean like symptoms?
So other symptoms or triggers. So you just mentioned one. You said it stemmed from, you know, your mother going out a lot. Were there others that you realized?
Yeah, I think definitely so many. There's probably so many. I would say a huge one has been, I don't mean to make it a relationship talk, but it is so predominant in that area of my life. I think when I was married, or when I've looked for someone to get married to, and I think a lot of women and men can relate to this, your childhood shapes that massively, whether we like to admit it or not, on a level. So I think I've in the past accepted behavior or ignored red flags, and that's come from seeing what my mum has accepted or you know, tolerated in her marriage, and how she was treated or not treated, and you might. So I was having this discussion just yesterday. I was saying, we may intellectually understand in a situation that you may understand, I shouldn't be being treated this way, or this isn't respectful behavior, or whatever the situation is, but for some reason you're still tolerating it, or for some reason that sister might still be in that marriage, or, and that's because it's so much deeper than just intellectually knowing. There's this entire subconscious element to it from your childhood, and unless you've really taken the time to look at that and understand that and heal that, you're going to keep repeating it, or accepting it, and one part of your brain is going to be telling you intellectually, this is wrong, why am I doing this, why am I accepting this, and you're still there. It's fascinating how it works, but I would say that's another one that's probably a huge one.
Yeah. And I'm interested to know what the diagnosis kind of was like for you, what it felt like to get that diagnosis, and when that was in your life, in your relationship at the time, not just your marriage?
Yeah. So I'd come back to London, and I think I was just getting on my feet, trying to find work. And I think I was in a space where I could make it the most important thing in my life. And I think mental health really needs to be it needs to be a priority. And I'm so glad that we have platforms like this now, because I think I came to a point where I realized without mental health, everything else that you're doing is gonna fall apart at some point, either eventually or in a dramatic fashion. Everything else that you're trying to accomplish, if you're not on top of your mental health, is eventually going to start to crumble. Whether that's your worship, your fasting, your work, your personal life, whatever it is, it's going to have an impact on that. So I think I was like, I really need to buckle down and get on top of this and see. And I think I also wanted to start exploring medication. So I booked the appointment in London, and went and got the diagnosis. But I think for me, it wasn't I know some people can get quite upset hearing that they, have a label now, which essentially, it doesn't sound great. A personality disorder doesn't sound great, but I think for me, because I knew for so long, it was actually quite validating to put a name, to have someone say, yes, this is what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And it does look and experience how you think, and also to feel less alone in the sense that other people have experienced what I've experienced, and then I could get on with looking at, well, what's going to help.
Right. And what's it like, I guess, a few years on and living with BPD, and I guess your experience now?
It's bumpy. Honestly, it's still bumpy. And it's really interesting with this podcast, because I almost felt like, can I speak on this if I'm not completely healed or doing completely well, and how can I speak on this subject if I'm not 100%? And then I thought, that's the point though. That's the point. The point is to have an honest dialogue about what it's like. And that's the thing with mental health conditions. It's not, even people without, let's say, a label, quote unquote, mentally healthy individuals are not going to be 100%, or the life is not going to be 100%. They're not always going to be, 1 in 4. That's a huge number. So now I'm much better. There's things now that on the huge positive side, I don't think I would meet the criteria. I think now I would be actually considered having just traits. So that's one thing with borderline personality disorder, because it's a lot of like behavioral. It's more behavioral than, let's say, bipolar disorders, a chemical imbalance in the brain. So that's something you pretty much would be on medication for your whole life. Whereas things like borderline personality disorder, you can kind of unlearn a lot of the behaviors that would make you fit the criteria for it. So I'm much better in the sense of, there's a lot of people who, like, I work full time. I got promoted this year. I, hold down stable work. I have my responsibilities. I have stable family relationships, stable friendships, all of that I think you wouldn't actually be able to tell if somebody, met me. So it's much better.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, I have my relapses, I have my days, I still struggle with depression. That's a huge thing. And I also think it comes out, I mean, it's so individual. So I think for me, it comes out a lot more inwardly. I do tend to hide a lot of my struggles. So outwardly, I'm doing all these things, that every responsible adult would be doing, or healthy adult is doing, but I still have those inward struggles. And so that's where it's like I'm much better. But I also think over the years, once you become familiar with what you have, you also know how to kind of snap out of things a lot quicker. So that's a huge blessing in the sense that I can call myself out on things quicker and get out of ruts quicker than I used to be able to. Yeah.
I think that leads quite nicely onto my next question about just what's the biggest challenge for somebody that has had a diagnosis of BPD, or and I guess it would be good to hear you compare before the diagnosis what was the biggest challenge for you, and then maybe after the diagnosis, once you started, as you say, working out some things and working on some things.
That's a really good question. So what were my challenges prior compared to now?
Or the big ones that really stand out? I mean, was it like difficulties within your relationship? Was that the big thing, or were there other things that stood out to you?
Yeah, I think now I can separate what's realistic externally and what's my brain's interpretation.
That's amazing.
And that was difficult. That was difficult to do. And I think some people, even without the diagnosis, can't always do that because people don't tend to self-examine.
Right.
I mean, not everyone. Some people are very self-reflective and especially during this month. But I think for me, before, if somebody said something a certain way, it could be a family member, a friend, anyone, and I took it as, it was said sarcastically or they were being dismissive, that in my brain it was fact then.
Or being
and I would just roll with that. And I would then be angry or upset or whatever, or fly off the handle. Anger was a thing for me. I recall breaking a lot of things growing up. So now, so definitely after therapy, reading books, it's not that I don't take things the wrong way, but I now have the capacity to be like, no, let's see what's really going on. Let's take a look at what this person said and how they may have actually meant it. And I have that space now to sit, and 9 times out of 10 it's not what my initial gut reaction was telling me.
Wow.
Which is, it's difficult, but it's such a relief because then you can act. It's so much, it makes your relationships, it's made my relationships a lot smoother.
I can imagine. The other thing I want to know is just about stigma, and if there was any of that for you within your family or other people, in your life.
So I think
BPD or otherwise, because you mentioned when you were a teenager you were diagnosed with depression, right? So all of that kind of stuff, I mean, what was that like?
I mean, so my mum's like, I mean, we're close, but being a Pakistani and born there woman, she, mental health is not, especially in their generation, is just not considered. So I had that diagnosis, and she didn't really do anything about it. And it's not, I don't have resentment for that. It's just how they, for them it's just like, what do you mean? What's that? It just wasn't, and especially in a teenager, it just wasn't taken. I mean, her views over the years, she's grown as I've grown. She understands it so much more now. And it's probably through seeing me and just through seeing in other people in our lives has completely changed. And, she knows it's actually a thing. But so I wouldn't say that was so much I mean, that may tie into stigma in some ways in our community. I think I feel it on a more subtle level, in the sense that I don't talk about my diagnosis really. Usually, like, I wouldn't tell people, because then you have this fear of how are they going to perceive me now, or what do they think of me now?
That's with you, that's not something that you kind of...
No, yeah, that's still with me. And I think it might also be because I feel like I'm doing better, that I don't want to add that. And people have people have an image of somebody who's like really unstable, and like, I mean, I understand when people are that way, but I think they would assume that I'm something else now. They'll paint me differently, as opposed to just seeing me for who I am once I say that. So I just don't tell people.
I mean,
my close friends, but
there's going to be connotations, like you say, and things that come with you stating any kind of mental health difficulty, and it's just maybe you're trying to save yourself and them that trouble, when there's no you know what I mean, no need to kind of conjure those things up unnecessarily. As you say, if it's somebody close to you and they just know you really well, it's a different situation.
I mean, I'm not happy with that. I'm not, and maybe we don't give each other enough credit. Like, I feel like if somebody came to me and said, I struggle with X, Y, and Z, I would actually feel quite honored that somebody felt that they could share that with me.
Absolutely.
But I guess not everyone, you don't know.
I mean, this leads really nicely on to how you think we, either within our own families or within our extended networks or as a community, how can we think about changing that stigma, really? How can we kind of begin to destigmatize mental illness?
It's such a loaded question.
Yeah. Do you think it's just time? I mean, because, we talk about generations and how it was just different for them. And
I think stuff like what you guys do, like this podcast, and you taking the time out to do this and talk about it, like, I've seen it over the last few years, and this is what we need, more of this. And that's why I'm so glad to be doing this. But this is what we need. We just need people
to speak,
talking about it. Yeah, I don't think we need huge, and I think we need that acknowledgement. I think our scholars need to be doing more of it, bringing it up in, like, alhamdulillah, they cover a lot of things, and they're also getting better in covering things. But it's like, the amount of people, of friends that I've had who, will say, I know Islamically it says this about parents, but then they're facing traumatic situations in regards to their parents, and they don't know how to I can see the conflict in the conversation. I can hear the conflict between, this is what my religion says, but this is what I'm facing, and no one's putting the two together. And I think, I mean, there is more of that. I'm starting to see more of that. Alhamdulillah, there are scholars addressing it and talking about it, but I think we need more of that. I think we need to just be, whether it's between friends or whether it's charities and platforms like this, whether it's in a mosque, we just need people bringing it to light more, and saying, hey, this is what I go through, this is what I have, or
And I think
if you know someone who, yeah,
I think also when it comes to the Islamic aspect that you mentioned, it's about, I think, just understanding just more about the Quran in depth, and
yeah,
the interpretations, and
yeah,
some of which I feel, you know, some people will use to either maintain their power or be
yeah,
whatever over their children, or have something over their
mm-hmm,
children or their spouse or whoever it may be, and they might twist things. This is
mm-hmm,
not kind of unheard of, and you know, we all
mm-hmm,
know about these
mm-hmm,
things. So I think it is, you know, goes hand in hand with education and research, and
mm-hmm,
trying to really deeply understand the Quran, and
yeah,
just, I think, look at it with a lens of absolute fairness. You know, it's
yeah,
not some, it's not one, it's not a scripture that gives, I don't know, you know, somebody else power or privilege over somebody
yeah,
else. And
yeah,
I think that's a real kind of misconception, and people try to use that to their own advantage, sadly.
yeah,
Really, actually very dire consequences sometimes.
yeah, yeah. And it's and it's alhamdulillah that there are different situations told to us.
Mm, mm,
And I don't want to sound like somebody who's,
mm,
you know, got that level of being able to interpret it for other people, but
mm.
you know, I've had friends with abusive parents, and you know, they feel like, oh, you know, almost guilty
Yeah,
for being in that situation. And I'm turning around and I'm like, there's, you know, Prophet Ibrahim, and there's all these situations where not everyone got along with their family or their parents, and there's a reason we were given these different scenarios, because the same situation, I think we try to sort of paint like a universal picture of a family unit.
for sure.
And you know, especially with the parent child dynamic, especially with that. And I think there's this thing of, you know, trying to make us all feel like our relationship should be this particular way. But if you actually look at the different prophets, all of their family situations were different. The dynamics were completely different. And without even going into too much detail, that already tells you that it depends on your situation. And I think that's where, like you said, there needs to be more education
Yeah.
around, you know, applying it fairly and applying it in context.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, um, I'm sure many people listening or watching might have children, or
Mm,
they themselves may have gone to some sort of, um, I don't know, Islamic schooling when they were younger, or they might have gone to the local mosque, and these stories they would be familiar with. It's really
yeah.
interesting that, you know, the lenses that we look at them from, perhaps there should be a time where, if we're still, you know, studying the book, then um, there's just scope to go a little bit deeper. So it's not just a story that
Hmm.
we tell our children, but there's these learnings that you mentioned, these
Hmm.
teachings that really need
Hmm.
to be focused on. They're not just, you know, something that we want our children to know, you know, about the prophets, but actually
Yeah.
how can they apply those things to their own lives.
Hmm. Yeah.
um, I think those kind of takeaways from the stories that we, you know, either read ourselves or we tell our children, we should be really
Yeah.
thinking about how can we apply this in our own lives, how is it relevant to us, because all of it
Yeah.
is relevant. But it's that, I
Yeah.
think, I think a lot of us just miss that aspect. We think, I mean, alhamdulillah, so much reward in learning about the Quran, and you know, reading the prophets about their lives and everything. But I
Hmm.
think that key thing at the end is maybe sometimes missed, where, um, you know, we need to have takeaways for our own lives.
Yeah.
I guess my next question for you is, um, just a little bit more about your recovery. So you mentioned you're in recovery from BPD, if we can put it that way,
Yeah.
and whether there's kind of more that you want to share about that. Maybe you already mentioned about how you kind of notice things within yourself a little bit earlier, and sort of,
Hmm.
um, yes, I guess have that internal dialogue. and realize more what's realistic and what's other things in your mind. So are there other kind of techniques or things that you use now that have been really helpful to you? Because I'm sure, even for people that don't have a diagnosis or whatever it might be, there might be certain situations, I'm sure that you've just mentioned, that are common to a lot of people, even if they don't have a particular diagnosis or particular traits.
Therapy. If I could account for one thing, the thing that I feel like people just don't do enough of, and it's so life-changing, diagnosis or not, I feel like. So I don't even think you need a reason to do it.
It's just the access for me. I don't know how you feel about that, but it's going out and either finding somebody that works with you and you feel comfortable with them, but then also just, is there some monetary situation to it? Can you access something that's affordable for you, et cetera, et cetera? I don't know if you think that's sort of their excuses or whatever. Like, how do you feel about that?
I mean, not everyone, I understand, but I remember when I was working in a job way less than what I'm making now, and I had to make that sacrifice because like you said, like I was saying earlier as well, mental health, without that, if I didn't get that together, everything else is not gonna work. So I had to make that sacrifice. Like, yes, I could. People are okay. A lot of people are okay with using money on other things, but this is you.
It's a very good point.
If you're not okay, it doesn't matter what else you're buying or not buying. Like, I understand it can be pricey. There are different prices. There's things that are online now that will be less. There's things that are free. I mean, Listening Place is free. It is for people who are actively suicidal, yes, and not everyone is, but there's a lot of resources, and I think there are a lot of excuses, and I think there's kind of like there has to be something wrong with me to do this.
For sure.
Or it means there's something wrong with me. And it's not. It's just life is hard as well. Or you could be going through a situation that you just need an outside perspective on.
Absolutely. I love that you said you could just go. There doesn't need to be a reason. And I truly believe that. I think it just gives you that time to reflect and sit down, and as you say, it's an outside person, especially if you just find a counselor or a therapist that you are comfortable with. I think there are just benefits all round, no matter if there is something that that's dramatic that's happened or severe, or you're suffering. So absolutely, I would second that.
And that's it. So you were talking about the recovery process, and that's that was a huge part of it. First, in the beginning, it was very raw, because it was going over everything that happened to me as a child and what I saw and experienced, and then it got a lot more. It was a lot more about the present, the hard work. It's like, okay, so I would say, if we want to talk about the recovery process, I would say there's a timeline. Whereas in the beginning, it's kind of, for people with trauma, PTSD, sort of trauma-based illnesses, or even those who have other diagnoses who are chemical imbalance, but then there's trauma caused by that, or you could just be going through a traumatic time. I think the healing recovery process in the beginning is quite raw. You're just literally going over what's happened. You're getting the emotions out of what's happened. And then, so that was very much the first 2-3 years. I would say from 21 to sort of 23. And then I moved back from about 24 to 26. That's when I got the diagnosis. And then that was more kind of like kind of got out. I mean, those things, trauma stays with you, but it was kind of like I got out the raw. I'm much more sort of at the stage of acceptance of what happened. And then you kind of get to the stage of like, okay, well, what do I want for myself now? So then therapy was looked different at that stage, and that's where it was, I would go in with the situation like, this is what I'm experiencing at home. Maybe, you know, this is what somebody said and this is how I felt about it. And it's like it was a very analytical breakdown of what's going on inside my heart and head, what other people do, what you can and can't control, boundaries, all that kind of stuff. So that's why I would say therapy was so huge, because I had somebody who's professionally trained. So I would say, for anyone who's listening and considering it, is to know what, so like you said, you need to find somebody who's a good fit. But you also need to know what kind of service you need. So psychiatrists will be, you know, if you're considering medication, or if you need a diagnosis, they can diagnose you. And then psychologists will deal with conditions. So they're more trained, right? So something like borderline personality disorder, I needed somebody who's got that level of academic knowledge to be able to go through this process with me. Whereas somebody like, if you, like a counselor and a therapist is great, but they're sort of more for, I would say if you're going through a bereavement and you just need that, it depends on what sort of level of support you need, you see. So I actually see a psychologist because I needed that level of insight to tease apart what my mind does automatically from what I've learned, and push it to a healthier direction. So that was what recovery has been for me, massively. And then a lot of reading and YouTube has been a good, so I would say get books on the subject. I ordered so many. There's workbooks. If anyone has BPD, there's so many workbooks for it. So if you can't afford therapy, there's books. And then videos. YouTube videos helped me in the recovery process, in the sense of just listening to other people. And so then you feel less alone, and you feel like, okay, there's other people, and some of them are further. It's great because some of them are further along in the journey than you. So I would read a lot of like, I'm recovered, this is what life is like now. And then it was like, okay, great, so there's like a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, I'm feeling like this right now, but there's people out there who are now doing or living life, or don't meet the criteria anymore. Or so that's what it's looked like for me. And now I'm, you know, I'm still in therapy, but it's nice now because there'll be weeks when, one, I go less often. So it used to be weekly. Now sometimes it could be once a month. So it could just be like touching base. Sometimes it'll be fortnightly, but that's the thing. If you don't have to commit to it for your whole life. It could just be, you know, as and when. So yeah, that's where I'm at now, which is nice. It's nice to sometimes have a session and it's just like, oh, you know, nothing's really happened, just touching base, compared to before. So yeah.
My next question is all about faith and how you think your faith, if it's played a part in your mental health recovery or otherwise, because you already mentioned a little bit about guilt, or, you know, certain times where you think, you know, this is my understanding of my religion and this is actually what I'm going through. So how's it been for you in terms of your faith and your experience in mental health?
I love these questions. they're really good. They're really insightful. They're really big topics. They're what we need. Yes, faith has been a huge aspect, and and probably one of the most confusing for me. Not because of the faith, but because of my presentation of my illness. And like you were saying, where if we're not, because we're not talking about it as much, for example, I've only ever read about 1 or 2 other Muslims who also have borderline personality disorder. That's it. I don't know anyone else who does. So I don't have, I know a lot of non-Muslims, or I've spoken to or read about, or met up with in the recovery process, but or I've met someone, or I've met those who, because of the presentation, they're not religious anymore. And that's really sad to me, because it's really bizarre how it's worked for me, because it helps, and then I struggle with my faith, in the sense that I don't feel like I hold up, or I feel like I miss the mark, and I feel like I'm not doing well. And then I'll say, like, I'm not a good Muslim, and I'm not good enough for it, or I'm a hypocrite because I'm not meeting these standards, and I'm doing things that I shouldn't be doing, and those will be like coping strategies, or it will be a relapse. And then I find it hard to be compassionate to myself, and accept it as, well, it's something you're struggling with, because then I feel like I'm giving myself a pass. So you can hear already that that's all very complicated. That is a massive presentation for me. But then at the same time, so how faith came into it, I was actually agnostic in uni. So I didn't grow up religious. Our house was too chaotic. So faith wasn't really taught to me, other than going to the mosque and learning Arabic, which I didn't understand, which a lot of us did. So I knew how to read it, and that was it. I didn't know the stories. I didn't, of the prophets. I didn't learn about the Prophet. I didn't know him. So, and I grew up in an English culture, and then I moved to London when I was about 18, and I decided one day, and it was a very much like an anger reaction. I remember the day that I decided I was agnostic, because I just thought, it's fun. It's crazy, because I remember looking up at the sky. I was going into uni, and I just thought, well, I believe that there's God, but all of this happened to me, and all this family stuff. I had all these family problems. Like, how could, there was that kind of like, how could you think? And so I decided I was agnostic, and I kind of was just living my life. And I was looking into faith, and I wanted to make sure that if I was going to dedicate myself to a faith, I wanted to make sure it was the right one. And so at 21, after a couple of years of studying, I would say that, I almost would say, like, I'm kind of like I was born a Muslim, but I kind of feel like I was a revert, in that sense, that that's when I really learned, and that's when I really was like, this is who I am. And I wanted to make sure that I was Muslim, because I want that's what I believed was right, not because that's what my parents are, or by name, or whatever. For sure. So I went into the studies with whichever faith felt right to me is what I'm gonna go for, whether that was Christianity, whatever it was gonna be. Yes, it might upset my family, or whatever the situation, but so yeah, I actually came into it that way, and I had the revert high, which a lot of people talk about, and so faith has been a massive supporting factor for me, because, which, I mean, studies show that. Psychology studies show, even with BPD, I think it was in Iran, maybe I'll try and share the link, but they did a study about spirituality and religion in BPD, and it showed an improvement in symptoms. So, I mean, the evidence is there, and it's comfort faith is comfort. And I also feel like the restriction, people call them restrictions, but you know, alhamdulillah, we don't drink, so I might go through what I go through, but I don't have to then struggle with alcohol addiction on top of that, or substance abuse. You know, I know Muslims with mental health issues who have coped by drinking, you know. So it's not like it's a free, but for me it's been protective factor, in the sense that I would probably be a lot worse, or have to deal with other things, if I didn't have faith kind of almost tamed the worst of it. And it's a resource. I think that's what my therapist called me. It's a resource for me, that when I'm feeling low, I can turn to it, and I feel like I have someone there for me even when I'm failing. I mean, there's the flip side of it is obviously kind of what I was talking about, in the sense of there can be guilt, or I can feel like, you know, other people don't understand, my coping strategies aren't always the best, and they're in conflict with my religion, and then I feel there's a spiral to that. So yeah, it plays a huge part in both ways.
I think a big takeaway from me from what you just mentioned about faith is that self-compassion. I just think it's so essential, and without it, for kind of any aspect of our lives, it's very, very tricky to be, I think, just to be comfortable with yourself and be at peace, unless you have that certain level of compassion that everybody needs to have for themselves, you know, in every aspect of their lives, particularly religion, and how you are able or not able to practice it, really. And I guess the way that you view yourself and your own feelings surrounding all of that. Yeah. You also mentioned coping methods and strategies. So are there any that you'd say are kind of a must do for you, or friends or other people that you've heard of, that they kind of have these self-care practices or coping methods that are just their, you know, their holy grail sort of thing?
Definitely. So from one of my friends who has I won't say the condition, but sleep. It sounds like such a minor thing, but having a good amount of sleep, stable sleep, like my mood will be so much more difficult to manage, triggers will be so much more difficult to manage if you're not sleeping properly, or you're not getting enough. What else? Routines. And my sister's noticed with me keeping busy, I think having that balance of knowing when you're not doing enough and when you're swamped, and dialing it back. There's a constant in my life, there's a constant trying to juggle that, to make sure some people and so that I would say that's one. They sound kind of basic, but that's because they are, just like you said, holy god, the essentials. Like without those things, I would say at least having one or two people, which alhamdulillah, I know not everyone has, but maybe through organizations, or you know, I was going to meetups pre-COVID. I was going to PTSD meetups, and I actually made a good friend there too. So you can find your group of people, but I would say even just one or two people. Alhamdulillah, I'm really blessed with my sister. She doesn't have a diagnosis or anything, but she's that person, one of the people. So I would say having one or two, even if you have one or two people that you confide in, it doesn't have to be all the time, but knowing you have someone that you can go to if you feel really bad, or you really need help, or who's not going to judge you, and you can just call them or message them. So I don't really even have to do it, but just knowing that I have that available isn't that's another one I would say. Having good people around you too.
I think you've mentioned quite a few amazing ones there, actually, because although like you said, there are things that we might hear all the time, and they're just, well, we might not hear about them all the time because it's just a given and you think everybody's fine, but actually I you know, sleep is completely major. You know, I've heard a little bit about it recently from a friend of mine too, and I just think it's so essential and it's not talked about enough at all. And sometimes there might be even a culture of sort of, I don't know, staying longer at work, or just watching a film, or there's certain kind of things that we might do, and especially perhaps when you're a bit younger, you just kind of think it's okay, but it's really not. Just generally for mental health, let alone if you are diagnosed with something or you are going through something, it's going to make it 10 times worse. And definitely having those networks and relationships, it doesn't have to be a lot of people, but those you know, people that you can really really turn to if you have if you yeah, want to talk about something, and routines like you mentioned, absolutely. I'm kind of reiterating what you said, because I just think it's, because I have asked this question to other people before, and they don't, and sometimes, you know, self-care sounds like you just need to get in a bath or something that relaxes you, but actually it's about the essentials, and getting through the days and the weeks and whatever, and feeling like you have some energy and you have some positivity and some life in you. And those essentials, I do think we overlook them.
We do. And even you know, mental health condition aside, like, so for example, I've recently started a new position which my workload has doubled. It's been insane. And like you said about staying back longer, and I've been staying back longer, and my work-life balance has changed, and so many people can relate to that.
Yes.
Or with
and
children,
you realize, you think it's, you know, it's the culture, it's what you do, and especially if you're in a new job, you want to impress, etc., etc. But actually, ultimately, what's important is your mental health, and you're not burning out, you know. I mean, those things are so important, and it's like being aware of them and being on top of them. I hope the things we're saying are going to be helpful to people who perhaps are yet to have this, in the sense that they're yet to have a promotion or whatever, and this massive workload, and so when it does come about, they're just aware, and they don't have to go through the struggle of, you know, burning out, or you know, I myself have experienced that in work, where it's just been too much and I haven't realized it early enough, and it's to the point where I don't know what's going on, and you know, you feel terrible about it, like you're letting people down, etc., etc., so many other feelings that come along with it. But actually, if I had just been a little bit more self-aware before, and, you know, sat down with a manager or whoever it might be, and just say, this extra project or this whatever, is this something that we could take off my plate for a while, or whatever, you know. There's so many ways, but it's just like thinking about the balance that you mentioned, and I just really appreciate you mentioning it, because I think it's important for everybody, you know, whether they have a job or not, just lifestyle generally, and whether they're in work or not. I think it's so important to always be just thinking about, how am I gonna manage everything that I do in my life. And you can't be in two, you know, in two places at once. There's people that probably do just try and do too much.
Well, it's that self-aware thing that you were saying. You have to be self-aware of what's going on and pick it up, and then be okay with dealing with it and coming up with a solution, whether that's a conversation with your boss or your partner. And you know, this is too much, can you take the kids at this time, or can I get a line at this time, or ask, like, so I mean, a prime example for me is Ramadan. Like I said, I'm fasting, and can we be more flexible with my working hours? And that's what we did.
I want to hear, what kind of advice would you have for others, really, that are going through anything mental health related, mental well-being related? It's obviously a massive question, because you can you know, go on and on. So maybe give us your top 3 or top 5 kind of bits of advice for somebody that's going through mental health difficulties, whatever they might be, you know, whether it is depression or other you know, difficulties that you've faced, that you are obviously more familiar with.
So obviously it depends how immediate, you know. So if we're looking at top priorities, first one would obviously be making sure you're safe. So if you're in a situation that's not safe, you can't heal anything, and that goes for, so that's very directly relevant to what my mom was going through. You know, there's women in violent relationships, abusive marriages, or in family setups, and you know that you can't begin to address your issues if you're in currently still in that situation. So you need to take those immediate steps, I would say, first, to be safe before you can even begin to address the rest. So that sounds pretty obvious, but it is amazing how many people try to skip that step or try to deal with their issues in that issue, you know, and it's not going to happen. It can happen, it's very long-winded, and it slows the process down, and sometimes you're not, and physically some women are not lucky enough to get out in time. So that's what that's, you know, or if you're um engaging in, you know, with suicidal ideation, or if you feel like you're going to do that, or you're feeling like you're going to do that, if you're self-harming in that way, um, the first thing would be to get acute help, I would say. You know, either that's services or telling someone in your family and just saying, which takes a lot of guts, but that has to be your first step. So in more critical situations, I would say that's your priority, ringing someone, and getting that immediate help. Then I would say you need a plan. So, like anything in life that you want to achieve, whether that's getting a job, whether that's getting married, whether that's, you know, a couple trying to have a baby, you have a plan. And this is no different. Like, you need a plan. And so many people try to, like, when people want to lose weight, you know, you subscribe to a gym and you start eating different, and you have, like, I'm going to start this diet. And for some reason with mental health, like, I don't know why we don't do that as much. Like, you need, so for me, it was very logically, it was a bit messy at times, but I maybe that's with my educational background. You need to have a plan moving forward. So you need to reach out to a professional and and first figure out what you're dealing with, you know, whether that's a diagnosis or not. And then have a plan. Does that include medication? Do I want to try medication? Do I have no choice but I need medication? Some conditions you do. Um, does that include therapy for me? How often am I going to go? What kind of therapy do I need? Um, so that's your, you know, that's maybe a couple of steps in there, but but that's your next thing. You can't recover or heal or, you know, cope with your condition if you don't have the processes in place. It's like having diabetes and not having the medication or doctor's appointments that go along with it. So that would be the next one, and the other ones I would say are probably a bit more, you know, they are essential but supplementary. I would say support system, whether that's online, whether that's your friends or someone in your family, or whether that includes going up to a group or virtually. You need, humans are just designed that way, even if it's just to be able to have one other person say to you, I understand that, or accept you, even if they don't have the same condition. Like I've been blessed with good friendships, and they don't have what I have, but just being accepted as I am, or being able to just talk about it, that makes a huge difference. And having good people around you, and learning when to cut out the negative people around you. Because especially if you're dealing with a mental health issue, if you're depressed and you have someone around you invalidating you or making you feel bad for it, or making you feel like you're not depressed, you're just lazy, or, you know, which so many people have heard that, but you're not going to recover with people like that around you.
Do you think that's one of the biggest aspects to recovery, is having the right people around you, whether it's few or many? You know, it might be few,
Yeah.
it might just be a handful.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And especially the closer the relationship is. Like if it's your spouse, and I'm not, you know, I'm not advocating what people should do, but they're such a huge part of your life. They're there every day. If you have somebody who's invalidating you, or if you're in a dangerous situation, or they're not understanding how bad the situation is, you're not going to be able to focus on your recovery. It's kind of like quicksand, right? So you're trying to get out and somebody else is kind of dragging you back in and slowing you down. Or it might be family or your friends. And I appreciate you can't always get rid of or cut off, shall I say, some family situations. But then it's a case of looking at where can I limit contact
and boundaries,
or draw boundaries. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that's a huge part, because with the right people, you might not feel confident right now, or you might have low self-esteem right now, but with the right friends, for example, telling you like you don't need to feel that way about yourself, or you don't need to accept that, or no, you're not like this kind of person, you're actually a great, just having someone say actually you're a great person, or this, accepting you and treating you how eventually that's going to rub off on you yourself, and change your own self-talk. So yeah, definitely.
Amazing. Aisha, honestly, it's been such a good conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it, because I've really
Yeah,
thoroughly enjoyed myself.
alhamdulillah.
Anything else before we sort of finish that you wanted to say that I didn't ask you, or anything that you wanted to mention at all?
No, Jose, you had really good questions, like really thought provoking. I had to think, you know. But I, if anything, I would just say Jazakallah, and I'm so grateful that you guys have had me on there, or that you felt like, just to ask little old me what I thought, or just to share my story. But I think I'm really proud of what you guys do, and we need more of it. And so I just, inshallah, Allah blesses all of you for doing what you're doing. And inshallah, people benefit from this. And I'm glad that last question, if anyone's listening to this, I think the other thing was, if anybody's listening to this and they can relate, I really hope they take even one aspect of what we talked about and get the help they need, or take that first step. So I think to anybody who's listening, yeah, take that first step. And like I said, it doesn't even have to be, you don't need a diagnosis. If you feel like you're struggling in any way, just take that first step and then go with that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Inshallah, and I mean for everything you said. And we're so grateful that you joined us and shared your story. And I hope it is sort of, I guess, the beginning of more people that will want to share their stories and their experiences. And we value, somebody like yourself and others, hopefully down the line, who will just talk, as you say. And I think the more the merrier. And it's not just necessarily a podcast for people that we might want, a scholar or a teacher or a psychologist or a doctor come on and speak, but actually people that have lived experience, have so much that other people can just relate to and gain from their experiences and learn. So Jazakallah khair for joining me. It's been wonderful to meet you, and inshallah we will conclude there. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take
Thank you.
care.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Mindful Muslim podcast with Aiysha Khalil, and that you found this a beneficial conversation, inshallah. I will see you on the next one.